Hey, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, quite a stack of crucial sources, major news reports, all centered on the very latest efforts, to achieve a ceasefire and secure the release of hostages in Gaza. Our mission right now is to take this material, dive deep into the specifics, and really try to pull out the absolute most important nuggets so you can get a clear picture. We're talking about the proposal reportedly on the table, who the reports say agreed to what and why. Well, according to these documents, things are proving so incredibly difficult to move forward. It's about giving you that core understanding straight from the information provided here.
Yeah, and this is obviously a topic that carries immense weight and complexity. It's really vital to remember that our goal here is purely to synthesize the information from these specific documents you've gathered.
Yeah.
We're sort of acting as your guides through these reports, helping you understand the key points and the stated positions of the parties involved, just as they are presented in this material, without adding our own opinions or taking sides.
Absolutely. Just sticking to the facts as they're reported in these articles. So let's jump right in. What do the sources identify as the core development here?
Okay, let's unpack this. So at the heart of these reports is news that a new proposal for a ceasefire and hostage release has been put forward. It's reportedly spearheaded by the U.S., and U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff is specifically mentioned as presenting the plan.
And this is where the reports immediately get, well, fascinating, right? According to multiple sources we've looked at, the White House actually confirmed that Israel had signed off on this plan. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is cited, stating Israel backed and supported it before it was even sent over to Hamas.
That's a really significant detail drawn straight from these documents. And reports from Israeli media also seem to add weight to this. They cited Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly telling families of hostages that, yes, Israel had accepted the Witkoff plan. And apparently, his office, when they were asked about these remarks, they didn't deny them, according to the reports.
Okay, so the sources paint a picture where, at least from the perspective presented by the White House and these Israeli media reports, this specific proposal had Israel's reported agreement. But then the reports immediately turned to the reaction from the other side.
Right. The documents indicate that senior Hamas officials have signaled, significant issues with, or maybe even a likely rejection of, this latest proposal. The stated reason in the reports, it just fails to meet Hamas's core demands, the ones they've been consistently talking about.
But it's not quite a flat no yet, is it? At least based on these sources.
No, not quite. The reports do mention Hamas stating the proposal is still, under discussion. They plan to issue a formal response, and they're apparently still in contact with the mediators. So while they're signaling strong objections based on how they understand the terms, the door for negotiation isn't completely slammed shut, at least as reported here.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's zoom in on the reported details of the proposal itself. This is based on a draft reportedly seen by Reuters and also information shared by anonymous Hamas and Egyptian officials cited by AP.
All right, so what does this plan actually contain, according to these sources?
Well, the reports outline a proposal involving a 60-day ceasefire, so a pretty significant pause in the fighting, essentially.
60 days. Okay.
And when it comes to the hostages held by Hamas, the sources mention a phased release. Now, initial reports based on that Reuters draft suggested Hamas would release 10 living hostages and the bodies of 18 dead hostages, so 28 total in the first week.
In the first week, okay.
But other reports, citing AP sources, indicate this phase happens sometime during the 60-day pause. It's a bit fuzzy there, maybe. The documents note Hamas is believed to be holding around 58 hostages in total, with at least 20 thought to still be alive.
And what does Israel reportedly give in return for these initial hostages?
A prisoner exchange, a significant one. The sources detail Israel releasing Palestinian prisoners. While the specific numbers vary slightly between the reports we looked at, they generally point to, over 1,000 prisoners.
Over 1,000, wow.
Yeah, reports citing the Reuters draft mention specific numbers like 1,236 total. That apparently included 125 serving life sentences. Other reports, citing AP, mention more than 1,100, and that included 100 serving long sentences for deadly attacks.
Okay.
The Reuters draft also reportedly included the return of the remains of 180 dead Palestinians.
So a very complex, multifaceted exchange outlined in these reports. What about the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Is that addressed?
Aid is definitely mentioned as a key component in the sources. The Reuters draft reportedly stipulates that aid would start entering Gaza pretty much as soon as Hamas signs off on the agreement.
Okay, that's crucial.
And these documents really underscore the dire humanitarian conditions. They warn of catastrophic hunger levels impacting, hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 people, and report over 600,000 newly displaced because of the military operations.
Yeah, the situation sounds absolutely desperate from these descriptions.
And one source notes there was a nearly 3-month Israeli blockade on aid that was only slightly eased recently.
Right. So we had this temporary 60-day pause, a significant hostage for prisoner exchange, and aid access tied to the agreement. What about what happens after the 60 days? That seems absolutely crucial.
It really does. And this is where the reports maybe highlight some potential points of difference or perhaps just a lack of clarity regarding that transition. The Reuters draft reportedly links the release of the last 30 hostages to the establishment of a permanent ceasefire.
Oh, okay. So permanent ceasefire is tied to the final group.
That's what that specific draft reportedly says. However, the AP source mentions things slightly differently. It talks about guarantees of serious negotiations aimed at leading to a long-term truce and assurances that Israel wouldn't just resume hostilities right after the initial hostage release.
So maybe less explicit on the immediate permanent ceasefire, more about guarantees for talks.
It suggests that while a permanent ceasefire is the reported goal for later stages, the exact mechanism or the guarantees for actually getting there might be described differently across the sources, or perhaps aren't fully ironed out in the proposal itself.
Okay, that gives us a clearer picture of the reported shape of the proposal. Now let's look at why Hamas is reportedly pushing back so strongly, according to these documents. What other stated deal breakers?
Well, senior Hamas officials, figures like Sami Abu Zuhri and Bassem Naim, they're quoted extensively in these reports. And their consistent message, as reported, is that the proposal, as it stands right now, simply does not meet their fundamental demands.
And the documents are quite specific about what those demands are, right?
Yeah. Yes, very specific. They list a permanent end to the war, a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, concrete guarantees for a lasting truce, and the restoration of humanitarian access on the kind of scale previously seen.
Those are major demands. A permanent end to the war and complete withdrawal are huge.
Absolutely. One source quotes Bassem Naim using very, very blunt language. He reportedly said the proposal does not respond to any of our people's demands, foremost among which is stopping the war and famine.
Strong words.
Yeah. And he reportedly added that the Israeli response, as Hamas sees it reflected in this proposal, in essence means perpetuating the occupation and continuing the killing and famine.
So from their reported perspective, this deal doesn't solve the core problems.
That seems to be the message. The sources make it clear that Hamas's consistent stance, as reported, is that any release of captives must be contingent on a complete Israeli withdrawal and a permanent ceasefire.
Okay.
They also reportedly state they are ready to return all captives if hostilities cease and there's a full withdrawal. And importantly, they reject any demands for them to disarm.
All right, that lays out Hamas's reported position quite clearly. Now, flipping the coin, what about Israel's stated conditions and demands as presented in these documents?
The sources report Prime Minister Netanyahu's position has been pretty consistent as well. He's reportedly refused to end the war until all hostages are returned, and Hamas is either destroyed or disarmed and potentially exiled.
So that's a direct counterpoint to Hamas's central demand for a permanent ceasefire to withdrawal right now.
Precisely. The documents report that Israel's stance explicitly rejects Hamas's demand for a complete withdrawal and a permanent ceasefire at this particular moment.
And what about the dismantling of Hamas?
Yeah. The sources also mention Israel's insistence that Hamas must disarm completely and be dismantled as both a military and governing entity before any agreement to actually end the war could be reached.
This stark contrast in stated goals just laid out side by side as reported in these documents immediately highlights the fundamental challenge, doesn't it?
It really does. Let's maybe look at the broader context these sources provide for this negotiation attempt.
Okay. What else is going on according to the reports?
Well, these reports place this proposed deal against the backdrop of an intensifying Israeli military offensive in Gaza. This offensive reportedly resumed after a previous temporary truce broke down back in March.
Right. The fighting picked up again.
And the sources include some pretty grim figures from the Hamas-run health ministry regarding the death toll. They note it's reached nearly 4,000 in just the past 10 weeks alone.
4,000 in 10 weeks.
And surpassing 54,000 overall since October 2023. Of course, it's important, as the sources themselves remind us, that these figures haven't been independently verified.
Understood. But they paint a picture of intense, ongoing conflict.
Definitely. The military operations reportedly intensified specifically around March 18th, And then there were expanded efforts to take territorial control beginning around May 19th.
And amidst all that intensified fighting, the sources mentioned that limited easing of the blockade around May 20th.
Yeah, to allow in basic food supplies. It was reportedly an effort to stave off famine conditions.
And just to anchor this, the entire conflict, as the sources remind us, began with that Hamas cross-border attack on southern Israel on October 7th, 2023. That attack resulted in about 1,200 deaths and the capture of 251 hostages, according to the reports.
And it's worth noting the reports mentioned that previous ceasefire agreements did lead to the return of some hostages.
Right, there was some success earlier.
197 in total across previous deals, 148 of whom were alive. So this history shows that temporary pauses and exchanges, they are possible under certain conditions.
And who are the key players trying to make this happen now? The mediators.
The reports mention the U.S., with Steve Witkoff playing a key role apparently alongside Egypt and Qatar. They're the ones facilitating these difficult talks.
It sounds incredibly challenging.
And the documents also give us a glimpse into just how difficult the communication can be. They mentioned some conflicting reports from earlier in the week about a different general framework agreement. Hamas apparently claimed it existed, but U.S. officials and Witkoff reportedly denied it.
Right, so even agreeing on what's being discussed seems problematic sometimes.
It illustrates how fraught and unclear the communication channels can become, even when there's supposed progress being made.
And what about on the ground? The aid situation.
Even with attempts to get aid in, the sources highlight ongoing challenges with distribution. They mention the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is backed by the U.S. and Israel, and also report some really difficult scenes during aid launches, including instances where Israeli troops reportedly fired.
So all these elements, the ongoing fighting, the humanitarian crisis, the history of past exchanges, the mediators trying to bridge gaps, and these communication hurdles, they all feed into the incredible complexity of reaching any kind of breakthrough.
Exactly. So pulling all these threads together from these sources, why is reaching an agreement reportedly so difficult? What do the documents really reveal about the core impasse?
Well, the sources repeatedly, again and again, highlight this deep chasm between the stated core conditions of Hamas and Israel for actually ending the conflict. This isn't just about the specific details of this particular 60-day proposal. It's about the fundamental disagreement on the end state. What happens after the pause?
Right.
So on one side, you have Hamas, according to these reports, deeply fearing that releasing its main leverage, the hostages, without first securing a permanent ceasefire and withdrawal, well, they fear that would simply clear the way for Israel to launch an even more devastating military operation aimed at destroying the group entirely.
That's their reported fear. And on the other side...
On the other side, the sources report Israel's fear. Their concern is that agreeing to a lasting ceasefire now, at this stage, would essentially leave Hamas intact and with significant influence in Gaza. And potentially that would allow them to regroup, rebuild their military capabilities, and pose a future threat, launching future attacks. That's a reported Israeli concern.
And the reports add another crucial layer, don't they? The domestic political situation for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yes, that's mentioned too. The sources note that his far-right coalition partners have reportedly threatened to bring down his government if the war concludes, quote, too soon. So that political constraint, as reported, adds yet another barrier to flexibility in the negotiations.
So connecting all this back to you, the listener, what these documents seem to reveal is this core paradox driving the difficulty. You have the detailed terms of a proposed temporary pause in exchange, as reported here, but these terms seem to collide head-on with the deeply held, publicly stated demands from both sides for fundamentally opposed final outcomes. Israel reportedly wanting Hamas dismantled, Hamas reportedly wanting a permanent end to the war and complete withdrawal. This situation, as presented in these sources, really shows this complex interplay of specific proposal details, those deeply held demands, the ongoing military actions, the dire humanitarian situation, and, yes, domestic politics, all contributing to the reported impasse.
And understanding the reported details of what is actually being proposed and why each side is reportedly stating acceptance or rejection based on their core demands. That really helps cut through the noise of the headlines, doesn't it? It helps make sense of why a breakthrough remains so elusive, at least according to this material we've reviewed.
Yeah, it's about looking at the components the sources present and seeing how they fit, or maybe more accurately in this case, how they fail to fit together into a viable path forward right now.
This deep dive into these specific sources really lays bare the reported parameters on the table, but also those stated red lines that, according to these documents, are currently preventing significant movement.
So maybe a final thought to leave with you, the listener, based purely on the information presented in these reports we've discussed today.
Yeah, what's particularly striking when you just look at the information presented here is the apparent incompatibility of those stated ultimate goals. Israel reportedly insists on the complete dismantling of Hamas as a precondition for ending the war. Hamas reportedly insists on a permanent end to the war and a complete Israeli withdrawal as a precondition for releasing all hostages. So, given these fundamental opposing demands as they're described in the sources, the real challenge isn't just agreeing on the terms of a temporary pause or an exchange ratio, it's how any such temporary measure could possibly bridge the vast gulf created by these seemingly irreconcilable stated objectives. Or maybe the question is if it even can, according to these reports.
A huge question, definitely a lot to consider, drawn directly from the information we've unpacked today. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep thinking about these complex issues, and, use the information available, like these sources, as your guide.